Welcome to the viewers of the Federal. Uh, the long anticipated discussion or the meeting summit between the US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin has finally happened. And with all the expected anticipation and the hopes of a result that could end the war between Russia and Ukraine, so all this really these talks raise this hope very high. But then there are also a lot of things that happened. So eventually, what was expected to be the talks were expected to be between 6 to 7 hours. It ended in 3 hours. At the same time, the optics were cordial. Nothing really untoward happened. But then to get to know more about what the summit meant and what has been achieved from it, and what can one look forward to in terms of the war, we have with us Professor Swaran Singh, professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University at the School of International Studies. Mr. Singh has been following this very closely, and he's an expert in international affairs. Welcome, Mr. Singh.
Thank you for having me on your program, and I think it's going to be an interesting discussion following the summit meeting between President Trump and President Putin.
Yeah. So, what are your initial takeaways from the summit, which ended just a few hours ago?
Uh, that's right. It just ended a few hours ago. There was even a press briefing by both the presidents, except that questions were not allowed. Let me look at the positives first. President Putin has met several American presidents over the last 25 years when he's been at the national leadership, both as president and prime minister. He's met them 48 times. But his hosting in United States was happened in 2007. So it's a good sign that he was again invited to United States. For him, it was liberating because, as you remember, given the International Criminal Court warrants, he's not been traveling uh, anywhere virtually except very close friends. And therefore, visit to United States is a breakaway from that as far as President Putin is concerned. Second, their own bilateral summit meeting between President Trump and President Putin happened in 2018 during the first term of President Trump. They had also showcased a very positive body language. Except that this summit meeting clearly happened in a very unusual circumstances where one item on the agenda was predominant in that sense. The whole preoccupation of President Trump right from his election time of stopping the war in Ukraine. So he had even been building pressure while on flight to Alaska, saying that if there is no ceasefire, he could think of very severe sanctions, that there could be very sort of severe consequences and so on. But when they met, then again, the body language was very positive. President Putin was received on red carpet by President Trump, invited to ride in the same limousine, which showed the warmth. So the optics were fantastic. But of course, there is no clear substance. And if you remember, President Trump started the summit saying there is if there is no deal until there is a deal. So at end of it, there is of course no deal. But both sides tried within that limited bandwidth that both sides had to showcase that A, they are willing to continue conversations, and therefore President Putin praised President Trump's sincere efforts. He invited him for the next summit in Moscow. So there is likely to be a follow-up summit, which will see how things move in coming summits. So there could be series of summits in that sense. So basically, a lot of good optics, but no serious clear substance. Also, the likelihood of their discussions on other important matters like arms control, the New START treaty, which puts a limit on their nuclear deployments to about 1,550 nuclear warheads. is expiring in February next year. I don't think any conversation happened on that. There was
Yeah,
likelihood of overall discussion on trade, on infrastructure, on Arctic, and so on. But if you again, the President Trump said there is not going to be any business until the ceasefire is agreed upon. So some of those other issues on the agenda were perhaps not discussed. And as you mentioned yourself, the summit meeting that was touted in the beginning to last for 6 to 7 hours ended in less than 3 hours. And
yeah,
in press briefing, there were no questions. So I think cautious optimism is how one would assess the summit meeting that
yeah.
happened.
No, at least there was a hope that there would at least be some kind of a declaration or an announcement of a ceasefire, so that to enable a more conciliatory kind of an atmosphere for the talks. But even the ceasefire doesn't seem to have occurred. So how do you see this? You think there will be a ceasefire, or you think what's your take on this?
The initial signs are positive. Among several other things that President Trump said, he had also called it an exploratory meeting, which will see how ceasefire can be organized. So, if that is the cue for us, then in that sense, this was partially successful because um, President Trump's earlier summits have often ended abruptly in a not very positive fashion, whether it is G7 summit or it is his summits with Kim Jong Un of North Korea. So compared to his earlier summit meetings or his meetings with President Zelensky, if you remember, in White House
Yeah,
in
yeah,
February, this was overall positive summit meeting, which keeps the door open for future talks for ceasefire. But it also underlined that there were enormous gulf, a big gap between both sides' expectations. President Putin underlined that we have to focus on the original root causes of the conflict, which he's been saying all the time, meaning that it is basically NATO's expansion, Ukraine's likelihood of becoming NATO member, and so on, which are the serious reasons behind it. And likewise, we saw President Zelensky was not invited, but he posted a video saying that he's ready for the peace. But according to him, Russia is not ready for the peace. Similarly, several European friends of President Zelensky had also issued a statement on Saturday that no territorial swap should happen without Kyiv or President Zelensky being sitting in the meeting. So there is likelihood of President Trump wanting next summit to be trilateral summit, but we don't know if whether President Zelensky will go to Moscow for such a meeting. So there are gaps which exist, and in that sense, President Trump is soon expected to now brief President Zelensky as to what happened at the summit meeting, talk to various European allies as to what happened in the summit meeting. So there is an incremental process that one can notice that is happening. And in that sense, ceasefire could happen potentially, whether that will be a pause or a temporary ceasefire with a fixed period of time, etc. And how both sides will interpret these things. In all summit meetings and all agreements, both sides go home with different interpretations very often. So that would also be seen in coming days as to how both sides are interpreting what happened in summit meeting. We are only talking about initial assessment
yeah.
from the reports that we have on what happened in the summit meeting.
In fact, there is a good possibility that there could be an expanded summit where you also have European leaders in it. I mean, plus of course Zelensky and Putin and Trump. But if that kind of an expanded summit happens, given the kind of sticking points that exists in this war, you think it'll be simpler, or you think will it get complicated? Because the way forward does not look very easy, at least given the positions of both the warring nations.
Uh, Dakshinamurthy, I fully agree with you on that. The way forward doesn't seem to be simplistic. It is likely to remain and perhaps become more complicated as we move forward. There are again differences. President Trump is very insistent on getting President Zelensky into the expanded summit meeting. But if you noticed the body language and the language of President Putin, who I said has had 48 earlier meetings with several American presidents over his last 25 years, he clearly underlined preference for bilateral negotiations. For example, he said we have both developed quote unquote understanding and we should move forward from there. And he, in fact, underlined that neither Ukraine nor European countries should undermine the process or the progress. So, in that sense, there seems to be also different kind of perceptions as to how President Trump wants to move forward in, as you said, expanded summit meetings, and how President Putin apparently prefers to keep it bilateral and focus on bilateral understanding. Partly because he assumes that it's going to be one to one rather than American and Western side being represented by several leaders and Russian side being only represented by President Putin. And in bilateral, his assumption is that perhaps he can obtain a better deal or greater concessions from President Trump. So there is definitely a gap in both sides' preferences as to how they want to move forward. So whether future summits will be expanded summits, whether there will be a summit as a follow-up summit, when that will be, where that will be, I think these are questions that remain as yet unanswered.
Yes, coming to the conflict itself, I mean, it's briefly, the issue here is the question of Russia returning the land occupied by it during this conflict, and Ukraine saying that they're not going to allow the land to be retained by Russia. So this is the at the core of this conflict and how it's going to be resolved. So where do you think it's heading? I mean, Putin and Trump have a very good relationship, no doubt, but how far can they go with it?
That's right. It looks like from the summit meeting, particularly, that both have showcased a good body language, a certain amount of chemistry between them. But when it comes to any conflict resolution or any such negotiations in international relations, parties usually begin from what we call maximalist position, so that they have something to negotiate, something to then offer as concessions and counter offers of concessions. So at this stage, of course, President Zelensky has said it very repeatedly, very many times, that there is no question of Ukraine surrendering any of the territory. In fact, he says he cannot surrender any of the territories because, according to Ukrainian constitution, it's only the national legislature that has the powers to recast if there is any possibility of national boundaries. So he doesn't have that power, according to him, and he says he doesn't think Ukraine is willing to do that. And Russia, on the other hand, is asking that much of the Donbas region, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, it's roughly about 20% territory of Ukraine that is today under Russian control, and Russia would not ideally prefer to leave that, while at the same time get a very limited few places vacated where Ukraine has occupied Russian territories. So again, Crimea was taken in 2014, so it's been with the Russia for a long period of time. And the other territories are also, they were taken roughly in the first few months of this conflict of 3.5 years. In fact, Russia has declared Donetsk and Luhansk as independent republics and recognized them.
Yeah.
So it's a complicated situation where Russia would like to retain much of this territory, as much as Russia can. And Putin doesn't want to give any of his national territories. But interesting it is that President Trump, who is kind of speaking on behalf of Ukraine at this stage with President Putin, had mentioned likelihood of territorial swaps. Uh, what that means accurately on the ground will be a very, very complex exercise. But there is an indication that President Trump is working on a formula where territorial swaps will take place. And if we look at history of Russia's military operations with several other neighbors, Russia has continued to occupy the territories which it had captured
Mm.
during those military confrontations, whether it is in Georgia or Moldova or some other neighboring nations. So that track record is also something which we have to keep in mind. So territorial swap is something which President Trump is suggesting. European allies are saying no territorial swaps minus participation of Kyiv. So even Europeans are not saying that territorial swaps are not a possibility, but they want Zelensky to be sitting in those negotiations.
Yeah.
So what kind of territorial swaps, which are now being kind of agreed in principle, will happen actually on the map, on the ground, is going to be very, very painstaking and complex exercise. So we don't see any quick solutions as President Trump would prefer. And
Yeah.
this is going to be a long haul of negotiations on both sides.
Clearly, what you're saying is was really indicated by the fact that both these leaders did not take any questions from journalists. It obviously meant that it's at an extremely sensitive stage, and neither probably wanted to say anything out of turn, which would ruin the whole thing. So obviously, it's at a very sensitive stage, and we need to just wait and see where it heads, at least to see if the fighting ends, at least temporarily, post the summit. But I think we need to observe further and see how it goes. What's your
I
take
agree
on
with
this?
you. I think it was a mature and positive sign that they did not allow any questions, thinking that responses or the questions themselves could be disruptive to the positive process, and that they want to cautiously move forward. Whether this summit is going to lead to any kind of ceasefire or even pause or some kind of arrangement where attacks could be restricted, limited. There is no such sign as of now. In fact, it very often happens, as you know, in international negotiations, that both parties would like to bring greater pressure on the other side. And that normally happens with heavier and more expensive attacks on the ground, so that they can showcase them being in control of the situation or them being on the offensive to create that pressure points kind of situation for the opposite side. So, opposite to expecting a kind of lowering of tensions or reduction in military onslaughts, there is even possibility that both sides could try to expand and sort of intensify their attacks on each other so that they can create pressures for drawing greater concessions on both sides. But this has also to be understood in terms of a long war of 3.5 years now. And there is a certain fatigue on both sides. So one has to see how whether they will have kind of splashes of more attacks or constant sustained more attacks on each other. 3.5 years has also caused a certain amount of fatigue on both sides on the ground. And I think in that sense, one is not very clear whether it's going to have more severe tensions and military attacks or less. But yes, it's not looking that the summit meeting is going to create any positive signs that both sides could suddenly think of stopping to attack each other.
Yeah. On that note, I think we'll have to leave it, because I think it's a little too early to come to more conclusions. But thank you so much, Mr. Singh, for throwing light on
Thank you.
the situation so far. And I think we need to have probably a few more discussions as the talks go on and the developments happen on this front. Thank you so much for joining the Federal.